Hello, in this video I'm going to get you up and running with Adobe Camera Raw, which is Photoshop's RAW plugin. Now you can use Adobe Camera Raw to edit RAW files, but on top of that you can also edit JPEGs and TIFFs too, and it's a great place to begin editing your photos. Now I'm in Adobe Bridge here and I've got a RAW file called fountain.dng, and with a RAW file I can double click and it'll automatically open into the Camera Raw editor. But if you're using a JPEG or TIFF, you can always right click and choose Open in Camera Raw instead. So we'll open it into Camera Raw and then we can start making edits using the Camera Raw plugin. Now, just a quick note about the interface here. We've got a range of tools along the top of the screen, and to the right of the screen here we've got a series of panels that we can click through like this. So these give us a range of really useful tools and settings. By default we open on the basic panel, and this really is the best place to start editing your images. So we can start off at the top here and then work our way down through these sliders. The first thing we might want to do is change the white balance. We can choose from these different presets here, and these closely match the presets that you'll find in your camera, or we can start editing temperature and tint manually. You can see if I drag temperature to the left, we cool our image down. If we drag it to the right, we warm it up. And in this case, I might want to cool it slightly. So I'm going to bring it down to somewhere around about here, I think. And tint allows us to correct either a magenta or a green cast. So we can shift the colors one way or the other with the tint slider here. Now, as well as adjusting white balance in this way, we can also tweak white balance using the white balance tool, which you'll find in the toolbar up here. We can grab that and then we need to click over a point in our image that we know should be completely lacking in any color. So we're looking for a gray tone within our image. I could perhaps try clicking over the woman's top down here and see how that resets the temperature and the tint. You can see if I click in different areas we get a different color blend. So we can go to about there, and of course we can always tweak it manually as well. So I'm going to bring it to 4650 and plus 25. Now let's turn our attention to the overall brightness and contrast. We can use the exposure here to adjust the brightness of our image. Of course, if we drag it upwards, then we brighten it. If we drag it downwards, we darken our image down. So I might want to just up the exposure very slightly. I'm going to bring it to about plus 0.6. And we could also perhaps add a bit of punch with contrast. Let's keep this somewhere around about plus 16. Highlights lets us affect the brighter tones in the image, so we can drag that to a negative value to darken down those brighter tones, and notice how that pulls back a bit of detail in that sky area there. With any of these sliders, incidentally, we can double click them to reset them to their default values, which is really useful. And of course we can drag the highlights upwards to lighten the brightest tones. So I'm going to leave highlights at 0 for now. Similarly with shadows, we can drag shadows to the left to darken down the darkest tones, or to the right to pull out detail in those shadow tones. So I might want to just up the shadows very slightly. I'm going to bring that to maybe plus 5. So the highlights and shadow sliders here can be really useful for balancing out an image. You can see there's a very bright area at the top right of the image and the bottom left, whereas the bottom right and top left are slightly darker. So we could try using shadows and highlights to kind of balance out our exposure a little bit. But alternatively, we can do this with local adjustment tools, which we'll try in a moment. Now moving on down below highlights and shadows here, we have the whites and black sliders. These allow us to set a point at which the pixels will go either completely white or completely black. You can see if I drag the whites across to the right here, how we brighten up the very brightest tones. So what we're effectively doing is pushing the brightest tones to pure white here. Similarly with blacks, if we drag that to the left, we can push the darkest tones to pure black, and you can see these areas now are going pure black and completely lacking in detail. Now what we want to do with the whites and blacks, if I just reset them again, is bring them to a point just before the pixels begin to clip to those pure white or pure black values. So I can hold Alt and this gives me a view that shows clipped pixels as I drag. So you can see as I drag to the right, you can see the areas start to appear, and these are going to be clipped to pure white. So when I drag that to a point just before those pixels appear, and in fact we could go to a negative value as well if we like. So I'm going to bring it to around about there, And the same with the black, so we can drag that down to a point just before those black areas begin to appear. So you can see, I'm going to bring it to around about there, I think. Now the clarity slider down here allows us to add contrast to the mid-tone values, and effectively what this does is crisps up the details in the image. If I drag it to a high value like 100, you can see how that really crisps up all of the texture and detail in the building there. If I double click to reset it and then apply it again, you can see the difference there. Now it's quite easy to push clarity too far when it gives us this kind of effect, so we want to keep it fairly subtle. I'm going to bring it to around about 26, I think. And then below clarity we have the vibrance and saturation sliders. Now saturation affects all of the colors in our image, so we can either add more color by upping the saturation, and that will just strengthen all of those colors, or we can bring it back down to a negative value to get rid of color, or we can double click to reset. Now vibrance affects the less saturated colors, so it works in a slightly different way by targeting the weaker colors in the image. So you can see if we push that to a positive value, we brighten up that blue sky while leaving the yellows in the building here largely unaffected. Similarly, if we drag it down to a negative value, we can get a nice desaturated look. And I quite like that for this image, so I'm going to leave that back at -30. And I think we're finished with the basic panel now. I can use this little icon down here to give me a before and after view of this panel. So I can click it to turn all of those settings off and then back on. And you can see the difference a few tonal settings can make. Now let's move on and perform a few other essential edits here. As I said, I want to try and balance out my exposure, perhaps by darkening down this very bright top right corner, and also perhaps darkening down the bottom left corner here. So to do this, I can make use of Camera Raw's powerful local adjustment tools. These sit in the toolbar up here. We have the adjustment brush, the graduated filter, and the radial filter. Notice we'll start off with the graduated filter here. If I click on the tool here, look what happens to the settings to the right. They change ever so slightly. This gives me a set of sliders very similar to those sliders that we saw in the basic panel, but rather than affecting the entire image, these are going to affect the area that we define by the tool instead. So we can start off by dialing in a value, and you can see nothing changes at the moment when I drag exposure because we haven't targeted an area of our image yet. What we can do is perhaps drag exposure to a negative value like this, and then we can drag within our image with the graduated filter tool, and notice how we get kind of a blend of tones here, where anywhere beyond this green line here or above the green line here is going to be completely affected by that change in exposure that we made. Anywhere beyond the red line or below the red line here is going to remain completely unaffected, with a graduated blend of tones in between. So you can see how we can change the angle of our graduated filter here, and it'll affect the tones that we want. So I want to bring it to around about there perhaps. You can see how that allows me to darken down that corner of the frame. Now we're also darkening down this top part of the building here, which is not really what I want. I want to preserve the tones in those areas, but luckily we can use another feature of the graduated filter tool here. We can use the brush tool to exclude that area from my adjustment. So I can switch to the brush tool here, and I also might want to go down here and check the mask option here, or I can hit Y to toggle the mask overlay on or off. If I toggle it on, you can see this shows me exactly where my adjustment is operating, and you can see it's starting to creep into the top of the building here. So what I can do now is, using the brush, I can select the subtract option here in the brush tool. Then I can start painting. I can use the left and right square bracket keys on my keyboard to resize my brush tip, or I can use the size slider here. So I'm going to use a fairly small brush tip and start painting over this part of the building here, and notice how that allows me to exclude the adjustment from the top of the building here. So we can start to make some really precise adjustments by combining the graduated filter with the brush option here. And if I hit Y to toggle that off, now that gives me a much more precise adjustment. And the great thing about using Camera Raw for these adjustments is that any tool or any setting we apply is completely non-destructive. So we can go back in and tweak our settings whenever we like. If I switch back to the edit mode and making sure I've got this adjustment here highlighted, I can go in and start tweaking my settings here. So I think it's slightly too dark, so I'm going to bring exposure back to about -1.1, and I could also perhaps dial in some negative highlights to bring back a bit more detail in that area. So I'm going to bring highlights back to around about -60, and I also want to perhaps just lower the clarity a little bit. I feel like there's a bit too much detail in the cloud now compared to the other half of the sky. So what I'll do is knock back the clarity slider here again to around about -60 here, and I also feel like I could boost the blues slightly, so I could up the saturation here to make the colors in that part of the sky a bit more intense. And I'm pretty happy with that. Again, I can click this icon here to give me a before and after view of my adjustment. So that shows you the difference that adjustment makes to my image. Now, I'd also like to perhaps lighten this area here and this bottom left corner here, because I feel like they're going slightly too dark. My image is still looking slightly unbalanced. So to do this, I'm going to switch to another local adjustment tool. We'll use the adjustment brush, which you'll find next to the graduated filter here in the toolbar. Now, when using the adjustment brush, we get those same set of sliders over here that we can load our adjustment with. Now, notice how the tool remembers previous adjustments. So we want to reset all of these. Otherwise, when we start making a new adjustment, it'll have those same settings applied. A really quick way to do this is a useful little tip. We can just click either the plus or the minus icons here alongside each slider, and this will load the tool with a new adjustment and also reset all of the other sliders at once. So in this case, I'd like to lighten this area here, so I'm going to click the plus icon here next to exposure, and notice now we have exposure set to +0.5 and all of the other sliders are reset to their default values, and then I can start painting. Notice when I first click how we set a pin over the image, and the pin controls the adjustment, so we can now paint wherever we like, and as long as that pin is active, all of the areas we paint over are going to be affected by that same adjustment that we control using the sliders over here. And again, it might be useful to see our mask as we paint, so we can toggle that on or hit Y to toggle it on or off, and you can see that gives me my red mask overlay. Then I can start painting over this area here, and I could also perhaps lighten up this area over here. And again, we can use the left and right square bracket keys to resize our brush tip as we paint. And once we've covered the area that we want, we can hit Y again to toggle our mask view off. We can of course tweak the area using the exposure slider here or any other sliders that we like. And I'm pretty happy with that. I think perhaps we could paint over this bottom corner here just to add that into my adjustment. And that's looking pretty good. Now I could also darken down this bottom left corner here. So what I can do is click new here to start making a new adjustment, or as before, we can just click the negative icon here next to exposure, and what this does is starts off a new adjustment. So now I can start painting with exposure set to -0.50 over this corner down here. And notice we get a second pin appear when we start painting. So now we can control each of those adjustments by clicking on either pin. So we can go back in and tweak those settings if we like. And again, everything is completely non-destructive. So I'm pretty happy with my local adjustments here. Now there are a few other edits I'd like to make. First of all, I can see that the top of the building here is slightly curved, and that's because we're getting a little bit of lens distortion here. So what we can do is go to our lens correction panel. Now I can just click back to my zoom tool here, and this will just bring my panel view back here to give me all the icons along the top here that I can access. And I'm interested in this panel here, the lens correction panel. I can click on that, and in the profile options here, I can check this option to enable profile corrections. And notice in the lens profile options here how the make and model of the lens used to shoot this picture has automatically been detected and a correction has been applied. If I toggle it off and on again, you can see how it affects my image. That's with it off, that's with it on. So we've managed to straighten up the top of the building there, and it's now a nice straight line. However, that line isn't perfectly horizontal. Our image is slightly wonky here. So what we can do now is try and fix the wonky image. We can use the straighten tool for this, so I can grab that from the toolbar up here, and then I can click and drag along a line that I want to be horizontal. So I'm going to start off over here and click and drag all the way across along the top line of the building like that. And notice how we now switch to the crop tool, and we get our crop box around the image, and we can adjust the crop like this if we like. So I could perhaps crop in slightly tighter, and notice how the crop now allows us to level out our image. Now, another option for leveling an image that is very useful is found within the transform tool here. So we can open that up and notice how we have these upright controls. We can use these to automatically fix wonky horizons and converging verticals. So I could click the auto button here, and you can see that straightens up all of those verticals within the image. We could go for the level option here if we want to just straighten out that wonky horizon, and we can go for the vertical option here to straighten out the verticals in that way. So I think I'm going to leave this to level because I don't really want to straighten up all of the lines in the building. Sometimes it can look a bit unnatural if everything is perfectly straight. Sometimes it works very well, but in this case I'm going to go for the level auto adjustment here. And I think we're nearly done with our image here. There's one other thing I'd like to do. If I again just go back to my zoom tool here to bring my panel view back, and then I'm going to go to the FX panel here, and I'd just like to darken down the corners of the frame slightly. So I'm going to apply a post crop vignette. So I'm just going to drag to a negative value here, and that allows me to darken down the edges of the frame here, and this just helps to draw the eye in towards the important elements of the image, which is of course the fountain in this particular image. So I can drag the amount slider down, and that just allows me to darken down the edges of the frame in that way. And I'm pretty happy with my image here. So what I'll do is show you a before and after. I can use this icon here to give me a before and after view of all of my edits, and you can see this shows you my original image on the left and my edited image on the right. In fact, we could go for a different view here, and this perhaps shows you more clearly how we're able to completely change the look and feel of our image with a few simple essential adjustments in Adobe Camera Raw. And once we're happy with our image, we could, if we like, save it using the save image option down here, and then we can save as a different file format if we like. We can go for a JPEG, we can even change the resolution and image size and things like that. Or we could choose to open the image if we want to bring it into Photoshop to make further edits. Or we can just hit done to finish and exit. So there we have it. That's a brief introduction to Adobe Camera Raw and how you can use it to make essential photo edits.